Hello and welcome to Simon Says Artwork. In this video I'm going to be painting on this old MDF board. I've had it for a while. As you can see on the top side here, I have a painting that I did start in university, but it's not it didn't turn out into anything. I didn't really make it into a painting really. It was just something which I wasted paint on at some point. So I'm going to now do a quick study on it and see what happens. Now first, let's find something to paint. Now when you're looking for something to paint, you always want to look at something with nice bright colours, good shape, something bold that's going to stand out and be really striking as an image on the page. Something with some variance in it, something which is going to engage with the viewer, something they can relate to. And there's lots of beautiful things around the garden. I mean, you just look at from plants to flowers to hedges to wildflowers. There's all kinds of things which are just stunningly beautiful. And I thought if I'd have a look around here and show you the selection of the things which you can paint, just so that you can assess your options. But you do want something with a good shape design that you can really capture onto the canvas. And also something which is a good 3D shape. That is, what I mean by that is that it's not too flat tonally against the rest of its environment. So you want something which is striking and bold and something which is going to stand out. So some good lights and darks represented in the light and shadow areas, but also just a contrast in colours. And what my eyes ended up landing on was something which, as soon as I saw it, I knew this is what I'm going to have to paint. And there it is. What a beautiful specimen. So let's get started. Now this painting was something which I thought would be given a bit of a head start with the background as it was. So due to the board being this weird abstract shape, as far as I recall, that wasn't based on any real concept. It was just painting in shapes and colours initially, which is part of the reason why it didn't go any further, is that there was no real concept behind it. So for this I thought it would be quite nice to try to paint it on top where it's similar colours. It's got the orange, and I'm sure that I would incorporate a purple behind, but I wasn't exactly sure to what degree I would be utilising the colours that are already there. Now I always use this mix of paints. If you can see on the palette, my palette is an egg carton. I just use the top of the egg carton, and I just use blue, yellow and red and white. So the primary colours in the white, and a jar of water that you can see there. Very basic colours. It's process yellow, cerulean blue hue, cadmium red hue, and the white that I use is a titanium white. These four colours, if you can include the white, are some of the most basic colours mixes that you could use really. They're nothing too expressive or mixed. I start off with just a yellowy orange mix, and I usually like to mix on the canvas, which is what you can see here. I'm starting with a large flat brush. No, it's not incredibly large, but it's larger than what you use for the details. And I like to mix on the canvas so that it does have a variance in how much the colour is mixed. I did used to mix colours in different pots, and I may do that again in the future, but for the time being I like having the unevenness, I suppose, of the application of the paint. I just think that there's more life to that look than there is when you just flatten out the colour and apply it that way. At the moment I'm just trying to gauge the proportions of the object that I'm drawing, trying to get an idea for the 3D shape. So you can see that drawing those lines, the diagonal downward, is the foreshortening of the side, and then trying to get a more horizontal line for the front, and doing little markers for where I believe that some of the details may go. It's initially fairly translucent, as you can see, by which I mean that you can see through the paint. It's not opaque, but that is something which you can either keep so that there is points of interest on these flat surfaces, or you can just continue to apply layers upon layers, and as the paint dries you can really see what you're working with. So I start to look at the handle at the back, and I'm trying to establish a more solid shape for the lid at the top. Looks like I'm grabbing some white there. Yeah, that's right, because there's already red and yellow on the brush. So if I dip the brush into some white, then it will just be a lighter mix of those colours. It's all very loose, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. It does take a while to tighten up paintings, and I'm trying to keep it fairly loose, and with this being a real-time painting, I thought I would show you exactly how I apply the paint and the decisions that I make. So mixing the red and the yellow made me then have this build-up of these light yellowy orange tones on the bristles. So then adding white just made it more of a lighter application. And then everything which I add to the bristles afterwards will now have a hint of white, unless I clean the brush, which I don't do very often because I like having the brush being a bit more corrupted by the mix of different colours. Just because it's a removal from what comes out of the tube. My thinking is that the paint out of the tube is the least interesting, and any action that you can take beyond that is your own decision making, and that's something that you want to aspire to achieve in painting. You don't have to, but that's just my thinking process for doing paintings. It's always quite nerve-wracking to see how bad paintings look at this early stage, but it is trying to stick to the vision that you have of shaping them into something a bit more presentable and interesting. At this stage you've got the opportunity to stretch and mould the shapes, the forms, and that's what I'm trying to do here, is to just stretch the length down a little. Doing a lot of this work with the white paint, because adding bits of red and yellow to the bristles just reinforces the mix that I already had. So the white paint is now really defining the form. And using this same colour now on the side is something where I'd have to re-establish the orange, which is what I'm doing here because it's just too light. So having the red and the yellow changes that tone. Now the reason why that's important is because it shows that the front of the bin has more light, which makes it lighter in tone of orange, and on the side it'll be a slightly darker orange, and even though it's subtle, it does have an effect. Now while the paint's still wet, I can just apply white paint to the front, and it will just mix in because the paint hasn't dried yet. So you just brush it in, and I have the orange mix still on the bristles, but I also have the orange on the surface of this. This is the wood that I'm painting this on, which means that it all blends in, and it's almost emulating the experience of painting with oils. With oil paint, you usually don't have the opportunity to paint onto dried layers. It's quite often the case that the layers will be wet whilst you're painting. What I'm doing here is adding a blue to do some cutting in, which means that I can shape the outside form of the bin by using a colour on the outside of it. This just means that if you've gone too wide, it's just gone more bulged in certain areas, if there's a bulge in the shape, then you can now sculpt that with the outside colour. Any lines which aren't quite straight, you can use this cutting in to then create a straighter line, if that's what you're intending to get. Now because I've already started with this, I continue with it because I'm going to have to clean the brush if it comes to going back to the orange, so I may as well continue with the cutting in and create this shape. But there is also the opportunity of creating the handle for the bin, which is a dark purple as well. It's almost a browny purple, so that's why I'm adding some yellow into the blue and the red mix, to then push it into this area where it's dark, but it has almost a hint of brown, which is where the yellow pushes it into, and it will distinguish it from the cutting in colour. In hindsight, I should have used a different brush for this blob on the side, so this is a mistake that I make. I'm often too impatient with this part of the process. And you can see it's quite a browny purple. I can imagine now what I'm looking to do is clean the brush. So I'm getting some blue roll and removing as much paint from the bristles as possible. Instead of just wasting it on the blue roll, I put it onto the canvas, and you can see when it's on the canvas that it's quite a browny, reddy purple. Now, I was a bit clumsy with how I'm putting it onto the canvas there, so it cut the shape of the lid. You've got to be careful with that, because if you are, like me, a bit sloppy with it, it does change the shapes that you're working with. Now I can tell here that what's happening is the purple is just too similar to the colour of the handle. So I'm going to have to push that purple into a lighter tone. Now the brush touched the bin, which is unfortunate, but it gives me the opportunity to cut the bin into a more accurate shape to the reference anyway. So at some point here I'm going to have to start bringing white onto the purple. Here we are, scooping up some of the white paint, making it into a nice light purple colour. This way the background is lighter than the bin and the handle. If it's too similar a tone to the bin, then the values will be ineffective with regards to distinguishing the subject from the environment. That can be useful if you're doing it on purpose, but on this occasion I'm not, so I'm trying to ensure that the subject pops out from the background, which means that there needs to be specific value shifts that are considered between the subject and the object. Sorry, the subject and the object, the subject and the background. It's a similar tone to the top of the bin, but I think that you can get away with that. When it comes to the lighter side of the object, there's going to be less of a difference, but it's still something where it should be different enough where if you were to make it grayscale, turn everything black and white, you'd be able to see the difference between the light side of the bin and the background. They shouldn't be the same. They should be slightly different. Now the background could be something which I start to establish as something closer to the reference. But at this point, I'm just trying to distinguish it from the actual subject. It's all very loose and messy, as I said earlier, but that's because it's all still with the big brush. As your brushes go smaller, you tidy up some of these details. Now as I put the white into the top left hand corner there, you could see that with the paint still being wet, it makes the brush pick up the darker reddy purple colour, and that can then be pushed around the surface. If I refer to this as a canvas, I don't mean a literal canvas, I just mean that the wood is the canvas on this occasion. I've tried to avoid saying canvas when it is wood, but in truth, it's interchangeable to an extent. So at this point, I'm removing a lot of this from the brush. I not only wipe the brush onto the blue roll, but I also use the water to help push a lot of the pigment out. This way I can reuse this brush and remix some orange onto it, or I could just clean it and move on to a smaller brush. I do quite like having between 3 and 5 different brushes to do a painting and to go from large to small. The canvas there is getting quite, not canvas, sorry, the palette is getting quite muddy. The yellow has almost completely been used up, whereas there's more than enough red and blue because they're such strong colours you don't quite need so much of them. And the white is usually used up quite quickly as well. The background still needs some work, but for the time being at least it's pushed around the purple haze type of colour, just to make the bin stand out a little bit more than what it did from the dark purple and the strong orange that was on the surface before I'd started. You can tell what the subject is, but it does need a lot of cleaning up. It's still very loose. There's certain loose parts that I try to keep. I retain these areas just because I think that those can be quite a bit more interesting than if everything is clean and uniform, but it does depend on the style of the painting you're trying to achieve. At this point, everything is almost all mid-tone. As I say that, I'm adding white straight onto the top, which means that that's going to be obviously as light as anything will go. But the top is still wet. So as I'm adding the white, it becomes a light orange yellow. Or yellow orange, I should say. The perspective isn't quite right on the lid. It does need work, it does need shaping. But you can always keep working on that. The reason I say that the perspective isn't right is because the near side of the lid, which is where you can see the handle, should be wider than the far side. And it's currently not. Now, as I was saying, with everything being pretty much a mid-tone aside from what I've just done, it does give the opportunity to add spots of light and shadow on the very last pass of this painting. This is the first pass where I do my first establishing marks and shape and mould the subject on the canvas. I've mixed a dark purple, so it looks as though I'm going to be shaping the handle. And if you're very careful, you can add bits of detail. Part of the handle has gone a bit too wide there, and it is something I'm going to have to correct on the last pass. I try to do part corrections in this video, but I don't get as far as I need to. Sometimes you do have to leave it until everything is dried, just because the continuous wet on wet technique can be a little bit more restricting than you need. Now, because I've used a lot of the paint on the brush, I'm using whatever's left as very light lines. This is something which I like to do when the paintbrush isn't too loaded with the fresh colour. If you have too much paint on the brush, it can be a little bit too heavy and not have the effect that you desire. So for this, I'm trying to establish the 3D shapes by using the very last part of the dark colour. So this is all of the underneath lines of the lid area where shadow will collect to an extent, but you don't want it to be a drop shadow that's being cast across, because for that you want to mix a colour. Instead, this is trying to describe edges that have shadow because of the shape as opposed to the light. On the lid here, using the very last part of this after I've pushed this darker colour around quite a bit, I can afford to go on to the lightest part. As you can see, there's next to no shadow pigment left on the bristles, so I could push it across the top part and it won't be too dark. Parts of the details of the bin will really add a lot to the actual painting. The little observations of where the indents are, what the shapes are. Now you can see how dark and how loaded the brush was when I added that mark, but it is fairly deep in there, so I can afford to do that. Just as if I'm careful, I can do that on here, on this edge, because it just needs to be a line of very dark purple. I can either cut into that and get rid of it, or I can blend it with the shadow colour that will be cast along the surface area. I'm trying to be careful here because it's a cutting in purple. I don't want it to be too dark. I want a level of consistency throughout the mix, even though it can be cloudy around the bin. I don't want it to look too much like it's floating in midair or in space. It's less about the outside and it's more about what you're sculpting on the inside. I do think that I will be going back over the background to create the forms from the reference. But for the time being, it just needs to be a void so that I can distinguish it and it will pop out. I do think it has that nice effect on the subject. It's making it look so much more striking and bold, which I think is, part of the charm of paintings like this, is to try and make such a big deal out of a food bin, which is such a mundane subject to paint. Now, in order to not make it white, I do need to apply more of the purple mix. But because there's white on the surface that's still wet, my hopes are that it blends in. And I still have the opportunity to mix more white. It's a pull and a push, which means that, you do a certain amount here and there, and then you pull it back. You're sort of pushing it one way and pulling it back another way until you find something which works well. At the moment, if I squint, don't know if you squint at this, if you can see, the bin stands out from the background. The front part is lighter than the background and the side is darker. The top is lighter. The handle is darker. The handle at the side, I should say, not at the top. Now it's tricky there trying to sculpt the top of the bin. Probably needs more work on the second pass. This whole video is the first pass of a painting. It is a time-consuming process doing paintings like this, but I would say it's very much worthwhile trying to do wet-on-wet painting, because I find it much more enjoyable than mixing colours in a pot. To mix on the canvas is quite exciting, and I think it has quite a dynamic effect on the finished product. But then again, my style is more impressionistic, so that is my preference. That is the effect that I usually achieve, is an impressionistic look which is quite loose, and it's based on tonal values. But it's also trying to use heightened colour to express the emotions of the experience or the engagement with these objects or subjects. My least favourite part so far of this is the handle at the top. I just don't think it looks like it's aligned with the rest of the shape, whereas everything else, and the handle at the side as well, is just not quite clean as I think it should be. Although everything is not clean, as you can see, but I think it has a certain amount of balance to it, which the handle at the top is just slightly, it looks like it's been shaved off at the far side. I'd rather it not be. And the handle at the side looks as though it is bulging along that downward diagonal, and it just needs shaping to make it straight, just like the one which is cutting across the back of the bin also needs shaping, just to make it a bit more accurate and gratifying to view. These are careful little touches I'm trying to make. It's a poor choice to do these types of things with such a large brush, but for the first pass I suppose it's still forgivable. There's only a certain amount you can get done on the first pass until you need to move on to another brush. I do enjoy using a large brush for longer than I probably should. You can see there the mix I was trying to get. I was attempting to do a shadow shape using bits of the orange and bits of the purple. Would have worked better if the orange were wet on the side, but it's still got a bit of a shadow to show the distance between the bin and the handle. Just trying to diffuse it there, because it's slightly too strong and too bold, and shadows aren't usually that type of strength. I don't really want any white to be left untouched on that shadow side of the bin. Now the chances are I'll go over that whole shadow side again, but in case I miss anything, I like to have as much there on the first pass as possible. That way, if I do miss anything, it won't really hurt. I've pretty much painted out the shadow. What I tried to do there, but it does have a slight touch, a very slight edge of a shadow, but it's not quite as impactful as I'm going to want it to be by the end of the painting. Again, with the remnants of what's on the brush, I add to the shape on the top, try to define certain crevices along the lid of the bin. Certain aspects of this top part that I'm working on here just need working on, and it's the other side of it, in my opinion, needs lifting. It needs just to be higher at the top. I don't believe I work on that yet, but that is something that I will return to in the next video. As it is, I already quite like the way it's shaping up. It's got quite a bit of character to it. You can see the functionality of the bin. The character, I just mean the difference in orange to green to yellow to a very pale yellowy orange. I think all of these things add to the texture and the surface of the bin as opposed to it being block shapes. What I'm trying to establish here is that there is transitions between the edges of the front and a center, almost a triangular shape, but it's actually rectangle, but it's narrowed at one end. And I'm trying to describe that by putting darker orange shapes on either side, but because it doesn't quite go as I want it, I start to paint it back out. The truth about acrylic is that you can just go over it and over it and over it, so if something doesn't work, you can always just remove it and do it again. So instead of describing it with the darker orange, I try to describe it with the white. And that's the sort of shape. It goes narrower towards the top and wider towards the base. The mixes all become a lot more muddy the more you use the same brush for longer, so I should have moved on to another brush, and I advise, if any of you out there are trying wet on wet painting as I'm doing here, to have moved on to another brush by now. But if you are following along with how I'm doing it and you want to do it the same as me, just be aware that the palette where you have the colours, that will be becoming muddy because you've pushed a dirty brush into it several times, so you won't have the clean colour to get a stronger mix of colour, and the same on the canvas. It's just becoming more difficult to have cleaner mixes. Now, I mixed a very dark purple there, or a red, and I need white and I also need blue to make that become the purple that the background is becoming, really. Now, from what I recall, I don't think I shape the far end of the top handle, and instead I try to shape the near side of this top handle by cutting down into it. And the same with this under part here. Just trying to keep a consistency. If I paint a colour on the top on the outside, then it should be on the gap through the handle at the top. It's very pinky red, and it could do with being more purple, really. But I suppose in the long run it won't be important, because I am going to change the background when I do another session on this painting. suppose it's important to see the mistakes as well as the good decisions that I make. And some of this painting and repainting of the background isn't being quite as productive as it could be. It's more of an impulsive decision that I will alter as I go along. Doesn't hurt to try these things, especially with acrylic, because you can just layer it on top of itself. And sometimes accidents happen where it becomes a stronger part of the painting. Still trying to get the same colour through the gaps, which is what I'm doing there. And I believe here is where I try to correct the angle of the line at the back, because it's going downward. It should really just go across. So I think, as far as I recall, I cut into that line here. Yeah, I'm just trying to shape it off a little bit more. And the same at the back here. Just making it a bit thinner. It's thinner than the line on the inside of the bin, but if I correct something on the outside, it just means that the inside is going to need work as well. And I can always repaint the handle afterwards. So as much as that handle now doesn't have a consistency of width, it's fine because it's a note that I've left for myself to correct that afterwards. Now if I do paint in part of a ground, gravel or concrete on the ground and a bin next to it, just as a shape of a colour next to it, it's going to have all these different tones in the background as just texture. It may be something which I paint around other parts of the surface and leave in some of these different pinks and purples, and it will just be a patchwork of misty colours. It won't really hurt. So as I said, it's very loose, but as you can see, it's bit by bit shaping up an object which you can tell what it is. Very much a dry brush, which I do a lot of painting with a dry brush, which I don't mind so much. I usually like the wetness of the paint over water, but again it depends on the style. If you're going to paint quite heavy, then sometimes a dry brush doesn't really hurt. As you can see, it's got certain elements that really do need work and others which are shaping up a little bit better. Trying to cut again the top on the near side, and in the truth I just need to repaint the far side higher to correct that shape. Trying to correct the perspective, but it is slightly better. It's a similar thing with what I'm doing there, painting the lower part of the far side. It's trying to correct the angle so that the perspective works better. Now for an orange bin, you may notice that there's more brown and yellow and even bits of green in there, but I don't think that really hurts, and I will be applying orange afterwards, in the next session that is. But for the time being, I think that's a good amount done. I think it's looking okay. It's an interesting messy painting. And that's the first pass. It won't be too long and I'll upload the second pass, probably next week. Okay, and that is the painting so far. It's not finished yet, but it's at least a start and it looks a bit better than it did earlier. It still needs a lot of work, but this is the first session that I've shown you, so we'll do some more work on it on the next session But for the time being, at least I've shaped up a bit of something where it's a subject and you can kind of tell what it is. I quite like some of the colours, but obviously this is just a first pass, so on the second pass we'll have a lot more texture going in there. We'll freshen up some of those angles to make it look a bit more 3D and just give it a nice finish. So I hope you enjoyed that. If you did, then please leave a like, comment down below, subscribe to the channel, ring that notification bell so that you do get notified when there's a new upload, and I'll see you in the next video.